We're parents, teachers, and educators, and like you, we're passionate about restoring our culture for Christ. This is Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education.
Hello again, I'm Marlon Detweiler, and you've joined us for another episode of Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education. Today we have with us Pat Morley and Brett Clemmer. Pat, as many of you may know, wrote a book, Man in the Mirror, which has become a very extensive ministry to men. And I thought it would be a really good thing to hear about that. But before we do that, Pat, if you could give us a little bit of personal background on you, and then Brett, if you would do the same, so that people have a little bit of a sense that of who you all are.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you, Marlon, for having Brett and me on your show. We're excited about the work you do and the ministry that you have, and then also your viewers wouldn't know that, but you and I, we go back a few decades, back to when we were all newlyweds.
Yeah, I still remember very fondly coming over to a beautiful building entryway and learning about the book release of Man in the Mirror. I don't know what year that was. You probably do.
Yeah. Yeah, that was March of 1989.
Wow.
Of 1989. And that was the Maitland Colonnades building.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Pat, you have children.
Well,
I know that.
Yeah. So Patsy and I, we just celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary.
Wow, congratulations.
So that's a nice milestone. And so I met Patsy when I was not a believer. She was a believer. We fell in love. My answers to her questions weren't that satisfying. So I basically started telling her whatever she wanted to hear. So I basically tricked her into marrying me. And I think she wanted to be tricked, to be honest. So, and so we had a pretty awkward start to the marriage, but through her prayers and basically some young men my age at the church that we ended up attending, because I couldn't manage my life and I was desperate and needed help, and church seemed like a nice place to at least try to find that help. Through her prayers and some young men that took me under their wing and showed me the ropes, explained the gospel. I became a follower of Jesus, as my wife already was. And something took hold of me. And then, most of the really big ideas about Christianity take 10 or 20 years to sink in. So I didn't really understand grace for about 14 years. But on that day, when I did finally understand grace, we'd already started the Man in the Mirror Bible study. We started that Bible study in a bar here in, you remember the old Villanova restaurant. We started in the bar there. Pretty quickly moved over to the Winter Park Civic Center. That Bible study's still going on after 37 plus years.
Wow, that's wonderful.
Yeah, and so then, but it was after that really that I really had my biggest encounter with God in the middle of a business crisis, and really came to understand that His love is unconditional. And I was into performance-based Christianity because that was the only system I knew. So without going into much more detail, we do have 2 children. They're both married, and we have 5 grandchildren, and we were just in love with the Lord, and really honored to be here with you today. And we want to help as many men as possible know Jesus and become disciples.
That's what a wonderful focused ministry. Brett, what's a little bit about your background? You function now as a CEO of Man in the Mirror Ministries, and have worked with Pat for a long time. How did you? What's your personal background that led to this?
Yeah, I grew up in New England, Boston, grew up outside of Boston. And so I love my Boston sports teams to this day. So I'm excited to see the Celtics doing well right now.
That dies
But
hard. I've found Boston people remain loyal regardless of where they live.
we are. But yeah, but I grew up in a really wonderful Christian home. My mom and dad are my dad's passed, but my mom is still alive at 91, and they're both very, very godly parents. And I did not follow Christ very well in college, and then out of college, ended up in Connecticut and met this girl at this church I was going to, and it turned out she was the pastor's daughter, and we fell in love and sort of came back. We had both, I think, grown up in the church, and so it was very much something that we had been handed, and you didn't really have to figure it out for ourselves. And so I think we both went through that process together of figuring it out for ourselves. And so we ended up in Florida, have two kids. I have a 29-year-old daughter who lives here in Orlando, and a 26-year-old son who lives in Chattanooga with his wife. And I tell people I have 3 grand dogs, but no grandchildren yet. So,
Well, I'm sure
in the late 90s, I was in the nonprofit world. I'm sorry.
I'm sure that will happen. Grandchildren.
Okay. Yeah, well, I hope so. They're promising, but I keep telling them they're pretty empty promises right now. So, but yeah, they're doing great. So in the 90s, I was in the nonprofit world here in Orlando in the social service sector, and actually ended up helping develop some technology that agencies were using, and that became its own technology company. And in the late 90s, I was doing that, and then really just trying to build something big, and really caught up in the rat race, caught up in the idea of having a tech startup and making a lot of money. And I had and my marriage was struggling, and then the company started struggling, and a buddy from church invited me to join a men's group. And I, grew up in the church, so I knew I needed help. So I joined the men's group, and I said, "What are we going to study?" And he said, "I don't know. They handed out a book in church the other day for men. Just bring that book." And that book was The Man in the Mirror.
Okay.
And so in 2000, as the tech market was crashing and my company was crashing along with it, I was in this group with these guys that was just a remarkable experience of men really leaning into each other's lives. And the Man in the Mirror book was just instrumental in helping us talk about the right things, ask the right questions, hold each other accountable in the right ways. And so over the course of that year, the company went out of business, but my marriage was saved, my family was restored, and at that point, my kids were toddlers. So it was a really critical time. And so towards the end of that year, a buddy in the small group, I said, "Guys, I gotta find a new job. We're not going to make it." And one of them said, "I think Pat Morley's looking for a guy like you." And I'm holding the book in my hand, and I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And he's like, "You dummy, read the back of the book. There's a ministry in Central Florida." And so a couple different friends of mine knew some folks at Man in the Mirror. And so the beginning of November, we closed the doors of the company. And at the end of November, I came to work here at Man in the Mirror. And so I'm celebrating 23 years at the ministry this month. And so it's been a remarkable experience, and I'm really glad to be here.
What a great segue, Pat. I remember, and I think I heard most of this from a guy that led your real estate business, a guy named Chuck Mitchell. But I remember,
oh yeah, sure.
You telling him, and I may have the story wrong here, but telling him one morning, "I'm going home for lunch, and I'm going to come back determining whether or not I'm going to go this way or this way." And the two ways were to continue with Morley Properties, a very successful commercial real estate investment firm, or to step out of it and go and make Man in the Mirror happen. Give us a little bit of play-by-play on what that day was like and what was going on that led to it.
Well, Marlon, first of all, thank God for Chuck Mitchell. Chuck is a man of complete integrity. And he was a man who, he was the general manager of our company
Okay.
at that time. And I remember inviting Chuck into my office one morning several years earlier and lamenting that I couldn't really get anyone to ever tell me the whole story, you know, because I was the boss. And so I said, could I give you permission and would you be willing to take on the responsibility of coming into my office and telling me the truth, you know, when I needed to hear it? And he did a wonderful job, and he was gracious about it, of course. So yeah, I had become, I didn't realize it at the time, I didn't have the category bivocational, but early in my career as a real estate developer, after I received the Lord, I mean, I was out and out for Christ, and I was taking, you know, all my friends to lunch and say, you're not going to believe what I've discovered, and you're going to want to know about this. And so we were doing Bible studies and prayer breakfasts and small groups, and then started the Man in the Mirror Bible study, and then in '86, and then in 1988 had this leading to write a book. So I ended up writing the Man in the Mirror book, and it came out in '89. And so I was, you know, in the early days of this, I was maybe 50% ministry, 50% business. And then suddenly it was 75% ministry and 25%. Well, it got to be, you know, like 90% ministry and 10% business. So Chuck Mitchell, my truth teller, okay, so he got with our controller, and I thought I was coming to a meeting to set the budget for the year, and the two of them had colluded together, and they ambushed me, and they said, Pat, we think that if this business is going to thrive, that you really need to step back into the business full time. Well, that just, man, it sounded so wrong to me, and I was devastated. And so that's what I did. So that's picking up the story what Chuck said. Yeah, so I did. I said, I'll get back to you, and I went home. And on the way home, not to make the story too long, but on the way home, all the different possibilities are spinning around. But ultimately, by the time I got home, I said, you know, I either probably need to do what they say, or I need to go ahead and pull the trigger on going into ministry, which had been planted about 5 years earlier by our pastor, yours and mine, Chuck Green. And so anyway, I by the time I got home, it was kind of a black and white decision. Well, Patsy, and my wife Patsy, and you know her, she's not the she's the sort of consoler in chief, the Mother Teresa. She's not the decision maker. She's not the person with the strong opinion. But on that day and on maybe two other occasions, she, in our entire marriage, she's really felt strongly. So I laid out the options to her, and she said, "Let's go for it." Just like that.
Wow.
You know, who are you and what did you do with my wife? You know. But anyway, so yeah, so and then and so then that was the point. Of course, I didn't know what I was doing and getting into, but we fumbled around for about 5 years, and before we really, I was afraid to say no to anything, so I said yes to everything. And
Yeah.
but at about the 5-year mark of that, it just became clear that okay, the calling was to men and to men's discipleship. And so once we focused on that thing, there was it's kind of like riverbanks, you know, when you when the water is going down the river out into the lake, it just kind of swirls around, but eventually gets gathered back up in between two riverbanks, and the riverbanks give the water direction and velocity. And so when we narrowed the focus to men, we suddenly had direction, and then we had velocity, and great things have happened since then.
What a great lead in. But you've mentioned Patsy, and I want you to hear something that has stuck in my head for more than 30 years. It's the only thing that I can say I remember Patsy having said. And it's this: why are you so worried about that? And then inflation's hit us, so these numbers are off a little bit. Why are you so worried about that $100 table more than that $1 million child? When a child is damaging a table.
That's it.
And that has stuck. Please tell her I said that. But tell us, with Man in the Mirror, it has been focused on men from the beginning. I understand the value of focus, but tell us why men? What has it been for you all, both of you? And Brett, you started to talk about this in your personal experience, but what has it been about men? And of course, natural questions follow, and you can feel free to just jump into what you would expect those follow-up questions to be about how that permeates into more than just men.
Oh, Brett, he has set this up so well for you.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my gosh,
that's my job.
Put a basketball on a golf tee here.
Yeah. I mean, I just men when you influence a man, the ripple effects of that, just touch everything. So if you get men right, if you get men following Christ, if you get men, living lives of sacrificial leadership, you that's how you get marriages healthy. And when you get a man right, and then you get his marriage right, then you affect his whole family. And when you affect his whole family, not only do you have the generational impact of that, but you have the sort of the vertical impact of that, but you have the horizontal impact, because churches are made up of families. And so when you get a church that's full of healthy families, then that church can do the work that God has called it to more effectively. So in effect, you get men right, you get marriages right. When you get marriages right, you get families right. And when you get families right, you get churches right. And when you get churches right, that's our best chance to really influence the world. So it's just, and it's not saying that women aren't important too. Women are absolutely as important as well, but men have the other reason I think we focus on men, that there needs to be a focus on men, is because we have unique needs, we have unique perspectives, we have unique pressures in society. Right now, I think even more so, there's this whole cultural soup that we're swimming in, where people are calling, sort of normal, regular, everyday masculine traits, they're calling them toxic, and, sort of lumping all of the negative, there are some negatives out there, but lumping that all in with all the amazing positive things that men are doing, and amazing traits that men have. And so, we're one of them, we're not the only one, but somebody needs to stand up and say, this is manhood, this is Christian manhood, this is healthy manhood, and this is the impact that men can have in society and churches and families and marriages.
You all are probably, in the circles that I run in, and I suspect that you run in, maybe even more so, we see scripture talking about men leading families. We see, and that has all kinds of ripple effects that you've alluded to. Well, how do you address that aspect of society, maybe even that aspect of Christian community, that's dismissive of what I think are pretty plain scriptures, that man has a certain kind of authority that a woman doesn't, and with that, a certain type of responsibility. When I hear a bit of a feminist mindset object to that, I think, well, do you know what you're asking for? Do you really want this responsibility? But how do you all address that internally, or is that not an area that has become a problem for you?
Well, Brett, you want to take that, or would you like me to take it?
Go ahead, and I might add something on
and
the
you
end.
can add something. So we're pretty clear. In another way of approaching this would be to say, well, what is a man, and how do you become one? All right. And so part of what it means to be a man is to be, in most cases, a husband, and often a father. Now, not in all cases, and we have an increasing diversity in our culture, and that's fine. And we want to minister to all of the men, but that's the norm. And so we want to show men that Jesus, through his apostle Paul, the Spirit of God through his apostle Paul, said that husbands should love their wives just as Jesus, in his role as the Christ, loved the church. Well, in his role as the Christ, Jesus in traditional theology is known as our prophet, our priest, and our king. And so we teach men that we are to love our wives, and by extension, the fruit of our loins, our progeny, our children. There's no twisting of scripture to extend that beyond, but we're to love our wives, and by extension, our children, in the same way that Jesus, in his role as prophet, priest, and king, loved the church or his family. Okay. And so we teach men how to be the family prophet, how to take the responsibility for the spiritual nurture, care, and instruction of their wives and children, and then how to be the priest, to be a man of prayer, to be the man who is making sure the children are in church, for example, and getting the other kinds of love structure, roots and wings that they need. And then he's also the family king, so he leads, protects, and provides for the family. Now that's kind of like an analytical way of looking at it. So Brett, maybe you could
Brett,
put
add
some
the
life into
pastoral
those
tone
words.
to it.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I was gonna. This may not be as pastoral as you want, but I think also it goes back to the cultural mandate. Back in the very beginning of Genesis, God gave man and woman this cultural mandate to tend creation, and to take care of it. And then in the next chapter, in chapter 3, you see Adam get this role of being put in a garden to work it. Then he names everything, so he's providing structure and identity to things. And then it turns out it's not good for him to be alone, and none of the animals are suitable as a helpmate, although I'm pretty sure a Labrador retriever came. And so God makes a woman, and out of Adam's side, to be alongside of him. Woman means with man, doesn't mean underneath man, doesn't mean over man, it means with man. And so together they had this beautiful relationship, this mandate to take care of the garden and to fill the earth and to tend to the earth. And then sin comes in, and Eve committed the action, but Adam stood there and watched it. And so Adam's sin in that moment was passivity. And I think we still see the ripple effects of that now with men, that men are that passivity is one of the two extremes that men can go to, either just sort of sitting back and letting their wife be the leader, which is exhausting for a woman in a marriage to have a passive husband, or obviously the opposite of that, which is the aggressive, domineering, bad man in a relationship. And so we're calling men to be what God created them to be, to work alongside of a wife. If God calls them to marriage, God's doesn't call every man to marriage. We have to recognize that as well. There's a lot of single guys out there who are, Paul said that can be a blessing as well, as far as as being in ministry. So I think we're encouraging men to be godly men who love their wives well, who who live for the purposes of the gospel, to follow Christ and to help other people know him. And that starts in the home. The man has to be the family shepherd first before he can go out there and tend the culture and build a career and all those kinds of things.
I would append to that as well. I had a young man that asked me if I would meet with him, and I did. On our fourth meeting, he walked in, he sat down, he stared at me for a few seconds, trying to decide if he was really going to say what he wanted to say.
It was too late. You were going to ask him, you were going to not let him go until he did, I'm sure.
Well, he ended up blurting out. He said, "I have a mediocre relationship with God, a mediocre business, and a mediocre marriage." And then he just sat back. Wow. And so, why did it take so long? Well, he's just shared the most intimate details of his life. I mean,
Yeah.
No man fails on purpose, right? No man wakes up in the morning and says, well, I wonder what I can do today to, let God down, irritate my wife. Well, actually, probably a few do ask that question. But, generally speaking, what can I do to irritate my wife or neglect my kids? And yet every day, men are doing this. And so they need encouragement, they need hope, and they need the right instruction as well. There's a tendency sometimes to say, well, just trust Jesus. Well, yeah, you trust Jesus, but it's Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, which implies that you have acquired an understanding upon which you then entrust to the Lord. It's not trust in the Lord and be stupid. So we're into discipleship. We see this all the time. Evangelism without discipleship is cruel. We see this all the time, that men get sort of enlisted into the kingdom and issued a rifle, but then nobody ever teaches them how to clean and shoot. And so on the day of battle, they get slaughtered. And so we're trying to do something about that.
Yeah. Well, as you know, our work is primarily with children in the age of kindergarten through 12th grade. What thoughts do you have for fathers seeking to raise godly children?
All right. Well, Brett, it's your turn.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as a user of Veritas materials, as we homeschooled our kids, and I said my kids are in their 20s now. We loved homeschooling. There's a picture in the dictionary under the heading "woman least likely to ever homeschool her kids," and my wife's picture is there.
And I have thousands of women saying that.
I'm sure, but she was obedient to what she felt called to do, and we had a great experience with both our kids doing that. But I think as a dad who helped his wife homeschool his kids, and I was working, so my wife was really the primary homeschool. She was the superintendent of the school and the principal. I was the vice principal. The vice principal is the one that metes out the discipline, right? But the other thing is, for us, there were certain, one of the reasons my wife didn't want to homeschool is because she didn't feel, adequate. She didn't graduate from college, and so there were things that I was better at than she was, and that we went out and got help for the other things. Like I was the math and science guy, and she was the more the English and social studies stuff and all the stuff that related to that. And then we really plugged into local groups of homeschoolers and got a lot of enhancements from those relationships. We did a lot of stuff with other families that homeschooled socially, and field trips and longer than just a day field trips to go see things. We were also blessed. My father-in-law, I hit the father-in-law lottery, and had a great father-in-law who loves history. So he would do stuff with our kids. He was not local, but for instance, we met him in Washington, D.C. once, and first we wore our wives out, and then we wore our kids out, and then the last day he and I just did all the history stuff that we were both excited about. But so we never saw I loved being involved in the education of our kids. We were not the kind of family that set up a classroom with desks and a whiteboard. We weren't that kind of homeschool family. We were we were a lot more sort of set deadlines, meet objectives, and help the kids figure out how they were going to get there. And so subsequently,
Math
when
and
my kids
science
got to
guy came out
college,
in the planning, huh?
well, when my kids got to college, it was no different. Like they had a lot of autonomy for a long time. So while their classmates were struggling without structure, the structure that they were used to, our kids were just like, well, I've always had to figure out what I have to do and when I have to get it done by and how I'm gonna
For you.
get there. And so they just did it. So our kids both did great in college, and I tease my wife all the time. She didn't graduate from college. Our daughter graduated with a degree in math with a focus on discrete analysis, and our son was a philosophy major with a minor in entrepreneurship. So, and they're both highly successful kids these days, doing doing their work. So,
Pat, what would you like to add to that?
Well, Marlon, a couple of thoughts that would be hopefully encouraging suggestions, practical ideas that would be encouraging because they are practical for the dads that might tune in or might hear about them from their spouses later. But so I was extremely busy with building my empire, as a young man. And I had the advantage of, at that point of still knowing everything, right? But I one day realized that I was giving my best, the best of me to other people. And you had referenced it a little bit earlier. I came up with this question: who's going to be crying at my funeral? As a result of my wife challenging me with that, I'll not have you ruining $1 million child over a $300 table. That's the exact quote.
Yeah.
And they were putting scratches on the table, playing, doing things that kids do, and it really, really made me. I'm a contemplative by nature, and so I thought about it, and so I decided that I was going to prioritize everything that I do based on who's going to be crying at my funeral. Men, if you're listening, I'd encourage you to think about that or come up with your own way of saying it, but just think about who are the people that really matter and then prioritize based on that. And then secondly, make that philosophy actionable. So one thing I did, I've written about this extensively in my different books, but one thing that I think was really meaningful is we have 2 children. I decided to start taking one of our children out to dinner on a date. Basically, every Tuesday night, I would take one of the children out. We'd go get something to eat, maybe like a Chuck E. Cheese, and then we'd go either play video games or go-karts, sometimes go to a movie, get some ice cream. And after I'd done that for a few years, I realized, basically the only time I really have any meaningful conversation with our children beyond, discussing, what to do with the dishes after dinner and things like that was on those date nights. And our kids still refer back to those date nights as being a very powerful and, well, not powerful, but a meaningful time, something where they remember that they actually got to know their dad as a human being rather than as the dispenser of, as Brad has said, discipline and also leadership and of the family. And so, that's just one idea. Just think about dating.
We have, this has been wonderful, and I have so many questions I would have asked, but we've run out of time. But I want to encourage those of you that are listening here with Pat and Brett to go to the website, Man in the Mirror, look at the possibilities and realize that where you are is probably not very far from an opportunity to connect. And it's a great way for men to be with men in a godly way, for the sake of themselves, for the sake of their marriages, for the sake of their families, their cultures and churches. And it really has been a wonderful work, and we're so thankful to be able to have this time and let other people know about it that may not have heard about it. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Marlon. It was really nice to see you again. And to all of your viewers, listeners, we both, Brett, on behalf of both Brett and I, anything we can do to help you become more effective as a man, we would love to walk alongside with you and help you if we can.
Thank you very much. Folks, you have been with us on Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education. Thank you once again.